In the unforgiving world of military training where steel nerves and split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had faced down enemy fire in 3 combat deployments. She had rappelled from helicopters into hostile territory, diffused improvised explosive devices with steady hands, and earned her Navy SEAL trident through sheer determination and unbreakable will. But nothing in her decorated military career had prepared her for the moment when the very institution she had sworn to serve would test her in ways no training manual could ever cover. What happened in the mess hall at Naval Special Warfare Command on that humid Tuesday evening would ripple through the entire military establishment, challenging decades of tradition, protocol, and the unspoken rules that govern military hierarchy.
In less than 3 seconds, a single defensive move would transform a respected female Navy SEAL from a decorated soldier into the center of a controversy that would reach the highest levels of the Pentagon. The incident began like any other evening meal service, with 281 soldiers filing through the chow line. The familiar sounds of metal trays clattering and casual conversations filling the air.
But when Sergeant First Class Derek Morrison decided to cross a line that should never have been crossed, he discovered that some warriors fight back, and when they do, the consequences can shatter more than just bones. This is the true story of how one woman's refusal to be a victim sparked a chain of events that would challenge everything the military thought it knew about power, justice, and the price of speaking truth in a world built on silence. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez never imagined she would become the first woman to break a superior officer's jaw in front of nearly 300 witnesses. Growing up in a small Texas town where Friday night football games were sacred and military service was considered the highest honor, Maria had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or gossiping about boys, Maria was in her backyard practicing martial arts moves she learned from YouTube videos or reading military history books she borrowed from the library. Her father, Carlos Rodriguez, had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine before returning home to work at the local automotive plant. He never talked much about his time in combat, but Maria could see something in his eyes whenever the news showed footage of soldiers overseas. It was a mixture of pride and pain that she didn't understand as a child but would come to recognize years later when she looked in the mirror after her own deployments. Maria's mother, Elena, had wanted her daughter to pursue a more traditional path. She envisioned Maria becoming a teacher or a nurse, settling down with a nice local boy, and giving her grandchildren to spoil. But even as a teenager, Maria felt pulled towards something bigger than the quiet life her mother had planned for her. The military represented adventure, purpose, and the chance to prove herself in ways that her small hometown could never offer. When Maria announced her intention to join the Navy at 17, the dinner table conversation turned into a 3-hour debate that would be remembered in the Rodriguez household for years to come. Her father sat quietly, methodically cutting his steak, while her mother listed every reason why the military was no place for a young woman. The dangers, the crude environment, the physical demands that seemed impossible for someone who barely weighed 120 pounds soaking wet. But Maria had done her research. She knew about the women who had broken barriers before her, the pilots who had flown combat missions, the soldiers who had earned Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. She understood that the path would be difficult, but she also knew that nothing worthwhile ever came easy. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and determined in a way that surprised even her. The conversation ended when her father finally looked up from his plate and met her eyes. In that moment, she saw recognition pass between them. He understood that fire in her belly, that need to test herself against the hardest challenges the world could offer. Without saying a word, he reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Her mother cried, but by morning she was helping Maria research Navy programs and physical fitness requirements. The dock stepped to the desk from the dock. Basic training at Naval Station Great Lakes was everything the recruiters had warned her about and more. The Illinois summer was brutal, with humidity that made every uniform cling to sweaty skin, and drill instructors who seemed to take special pleasure in pushing the female recruits beyond their breaking points. Maria watched as women who had seemed tough and determined during processing week gradually wilted under the constant pressure and humiliation. But something inside Maria thrived under the stress. When Petty Officer First Class Thompson screamed in her face about her failure to properly fold a fitted sheet, Maria didn't break. When the entire division was forced to do push-ups in the rain because someone had left a candy wrapper in their rack, Maria counted out each repetition with grim satisfaction. She understood that they weren't just learning to be sailors, they were learning to function under pressure that would break most people.
The physical training was demanding but manageable for someone who had spent 4 years on her high school track team.
The real challenge came in the form of her fellow recruits' attitudes. Some of the men resented having women in their division, muttering comments about lowered standards and special treatment whenever they thought the drill instructors weren't listening. A few of the women seemed to expect Maria to fail, as if her success somehow diminished their own achievements. Maria learned to ignore both groups and focus on the standards she set for herself. She volunteered for extra duty, helped struggling recruits with their studies, and never complained about the additional scrutiny that came with being one of only 12 women in a division of 84 sailors. By graduation day, she had earned the respect of her drill instructors and most of her fellow recruits through simple consistency and competence. Her family drove up from Texas for the graduation ceremony, and Maria felt a surge of pride when she saw her father's face as she marched across the parade ground in her dress blues. Her mother cried again, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed at the kitchen table months earlier. These were tears of pride and recognition that her little girl had become something extraordinary. After basic training, Maria's orders sent her to Naval Station Norfolk for technical training and intelligence analysis. The work was fascinating and demanding, requiring her to process vast amounts of information and identify patterns that could save lives in combat situations. She excelled in the classroom environment, earning top marks and the attention of instructors who began suggesting that she might want to consider applying for special programs. It was during her time at Norfolk that Maria first heard about the Navy SEALs and the possibility that the program might eventually open to women.
I mean intelligent in an astronaut combat.
The very idea seemed impossible to most people she talked to. But Maria began researching the requirements and training regimens with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. She started waking up at 4 a.m. to run along the Chesapeake Bay, adding distance and speed to her routine every week. Her first deployment took her to the Persian Gulf aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln.
As an intelligence specialist, Maria spent most of her time in air-conditioned spaces analyzing satellite imagery and communications intercepts.
But she also volunteered for every training exercise and cross-training opportunity available, learning from Marines about close-quarters combat and from Navy EOD technicians about explosive devices. It was during this deployment that Maria experienced her first real taste of combat. The ship was conducting operations in support of ground forces in Afghanistan when intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target was planning an attack on coalition forces. Maria's analysis of communication patterns and movement indicators helped pinpoint the location where the attack was being planned. The airstrike that followed was successful in disrupting the planned attack. But Maria learned later that the intelligence she had provided had directly saved the lives of a Marine patrol that would have walked into an ambush. The knowledge that her work had tangible life-or-death consequences changed something fundamental in her approach to military service. This wasn't just a job or even a career. It was a calling that demanded everything she had to give. When Maria returned from deployment, she immediately began the application process for Naval Special Warfare training. The physical requirements were daunting, and the psychological evaluations were designed to identify any weakness or hesitation that might compromise a mission. Maria spent months preparing, working with a former SEAL instructor who had started a private training facility near Norfolk. The preparation was grueling and often humiliating. Her instructor, Master Chief Petty Officer, retired Jim Patterson, treated her exactly as he would any male candidate, which meant pushing her beyond limits she didn't know she had.
He made her carry telephone poles through surf that tried to knock her down with every step.
He made her swim underwater until her lungs screamed for air and her vision started to tunnel. He made her navigate obstacle courses in the dark while carrying wounded teammates who were actually healthy sailors earning extra money by making themselves dead weight. But Patterson also taught her things that weren't in any manual. He taught her that mental toughness wasn't about ignoring pain or fear, but about functioning effectively despite them. He taught her that teamwork meant being willing to sacrifice personal glory for mission success. Most importantly, he taught her that earning the Trident wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning of a lifetime commitment to standards that most people couldn't even imagine. The night before Maria left for Naval Special Warfare training at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, Patterson pulled her aside for a final conversation. They sat on the beach where she had done countless training runs, watching the sun set over the Atlantic Ocean. His words would stay with her through every challenge that lay ahead. He told her that she was about to enter a world that had been exclusively male for over 50 years. Some people would resent her presence and look for any excuse to see her fail. Others would expect her to fail and be genuinely surprised if she succeeded. A few would actively try to sabotage her chances, either through subtle harassment or outright hostility. But he also told her that if she could meet the standards and prove herself worthy of the Trident, she would earn the respect of men who understood what it meant to be tested by the most demanding training in the world. As Maria boarded the plane for California, she carried with her not just the physical and mental preparation that had consumed the previous year of her life, but also the dreams of every little girl who had ever been told that some goals were too big for her to reach. She didn't know that her journey would eventually lead to a moment of violence that would challenge everything the military establishment thought it knew about women in combat roles. She only knew that she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The Pacific Ocean at 5:30 in the morning was cold enough to steal breath and numb fingers. But Maria Rodriguez felt more alive than she had ever felt in her life. She was 3 weeks into basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, and while 42 of the original 87 candidates had already rung the brass bell that symbolized surrender, she was still standing.
More than standing, she was thriving in an environment designed to break even the strongest individuals. Hell Week was approaching, and the instructors were systematically increasing the pressure on the remaining candidates.
Sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and constant psychological stress were wearing down men who had arrived at Coronado convinced of their own invincibility. Maria watched classmates who could bench press 300 pounds struggle to complete simple tasks because their minds were too tired to process instructions correctly. The instructors treated Maria exactly as they treated every other candidate, which meant she was subjected to the same relentless harassment, impossible standards, and physical punishment that had been breaking SEAL candidates for decades. But she also faced additional challenges that her male classmates didn't have to consider. Every mistake she made was scrutinized for evidence that women didn't belong in special operations. Every success was dismissed as an anomaly or attributed to instructors going easy on her. Chief Petty Officer Martinez became her unofficial mentor during this phase of training, though his mentorship consisted mainly of making her life more difficult than it would have been otherwise. He assigned her extra duties, held her to higher standards than her classmates, and never missed an opportunity to remind her that she was representing every woman who might follow in her footsteps. The additional pressure was exhausting, but Maria understood the logic behind it. If she was going to earn the respect of the SEAL community, she would have to be unquestionably better than merely adequate.
The psychological evaluation sessions were particularly challenging for Maria.
The Navy psychologist seemed fascinated by her motivation and spent hours probing for signs of the instability or emotional weakness that conventional wisdom suggested must lurk beneath the surface of any woman who wanted to join the SEALs. They asked about her relationships with men, her childhood experiences with violence, and her long-term career goals in ways that felt more invasive than the standard evaluation protocols.
Maria answered their questions honestly but carefully, understanding that every word would be analyzed and potentially used to justify removing her from the program. She talked about her desire to serve her country in the most meaningful way possible, her commitment to meeting the same standards expected of male candidates, and her belief that diversity of perspective and experience made teams stronger, not weaker.
The combat diving phase of training pushed Maria to her absolute limits.
The underwater exercises required candidates to solve complex problems while holding their breath for periods that would challenge even experienced free divers. Instructors would deliberately sabotage equipment, create emergency scenarios, and test candidates' ability to remain calm under pressure that could literally mean the difference between life and death. During one particularly challenging exercise, Maria's diving partner, a former college football player named Jackson, began to panic when his breathing apparatus malfunctioned during a night dive. The protocol was clear: surface immediately and signal for instructor assistance. But Maria could see that Jackson was too disoriented to follow proper procedures, and his erratic movements were making the situation more dangerous for both of them. Without hesitation, Maria shared her air supply with Jackson while guiding him through the emergency ascent procedure they had practiced dozens of times. David's death incorporation was essentially dangerous. David's death incorporation was the central of Erratican's sentence. Her calm response and quick thinking probably saved both their lives, but more importantly, from the instructor's perspective, it demonstrated the kind of instinctive teamwork and selflessness that defined successful special operations personnel. Jackson never forgot that moment, and he became one of Maria's strongest supporters within their class.
His endorsement carried significant weight with the other candidates, who had initially been skeptical about having a woman in their ranks. Word of the incident spread through the training compound, and Maria noticed a subtle shift in how the instructors and her fellow candidates treated her. She was no longer the woman who was trying to become a SEAL. She was a candidate who happened to be a woman.
Hell Week began on a Sunday night with the traditional surf torture session.
Candidates were ordered to lie down in the frigid Pacific Ocean surf, linking arms while waves crashed over their bodies for hours.
Like down Let's Take Incognator apples.
The combination of cold water, sleep deprivation, and physical exhaustion was designed to break down mental defenses and reveal each candidate's true character under extreme stress. Maria had prepared for this moment for over a year, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the reality of Hell Week. The instructors maintained a relentless pace of physical activity, moving the candidates from beach runs to obstacle courses to combat simulations with no rest periods longer than a few minutes.
Meals were eaten standing up in 5-minute intervals. Sleep was limited to brief naps snatched between training evolutions. By Tuesday night, Maria's body was running on pure willpower and adrenaline. Her hands were raw from rope climbing, her feet were blistered from constant running in wet boots, and her shoulders ached from carrying inflatable boats over her head for miles of beach runs. But her mind remained clear and focused on the immediate task at hand, whether that was navigating an obstacle course in complete darkness or solving mathematical problems while physically exhausted.
The breaking point came on Wednesday night during a combat simulation exercise. The candidates had been awake for over 60 hours and were being asked to perform complex tactical maneuvers while carrying full combat loads.
Several candidates had already been removed from training due to injuries or medical concerns, and the remaining group was showing signs of serious physical and mental fatigue. Maria was serving as team leader for a simulated hostage rescue mission when one of her teammates, a normally reliable candidate named Stevens, began to hallucinate due to sleep deprivation. He became convinced that the instructors playing enemy combatants were actually hostile forces, and he began responding to the simulation as if it were a real combat situation. The situation could have escalated dangerously, but Maria recognized the symptoms of extreme exhaustion and managed to calm Stevens down while still completing the mission objectives. Her ability to maintain situational awareness and leadership effectiveness under such extreme conditions impressed even the most skeptical instructors, who had been waiting for her to break under the unique pressures that Hell Week imposed. Thursday brought the infamous boat races, where teams of candidates were required to carry inflatable boats over their heads while running along the beach. The boats weighed several hundred pounds when wet, and the sand made every step a struggle. Maria's team had been deliberately loaded with some of the smaller candidates, creating an additional challenge that the instructors clearly hoped would prove insurmountable. But Maria had learned to use her smaller size as an advantage rather than a liability. She positioned herself at the front of the boat where she could help guide the team's movements, and her superior cardiovascular conditioning helped maintain team morale when larger teammates began to falter. Her team finished third in the race, earning the respect of instructors who had expected them to finish dead last. The final challenge of Hell Week was the around-the-world paddle, where teams of candidates were required to paddle inflatable boats from Coronado to Imperial Beach and back, a distance of over 15 miles in ocean conditions that were deliberately chosen to be as challenging as possible. The Pacific Ocean was running 8-foot swells, and several teams had already been pulled from the water due to safety concerns. Maria's team launched their boat into conditions that would have challenged experienced sailors, but their week of shared suffering had forged them into a cohesive unit that functioned effectively even under extreme stress. Maria took her turn at the paddle, fighting through muscle fatigue and hypothermia to help propel their boat through waves that threatened to swamp them at every moment. When they finally pulled their boat onto the beach at the end of the exercise, Maria felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had not just survived Hell Week, she had demonstrated leadership, teamwork, and mental toughness under conditions designed to break even the strongest individuals. The instructors' nods of approval were subtle but unmistakable. The graduation ceremony for Hell Week survivors was attended by families, Navy officials, and former SEALs who understood exactly what the candidates had accomplished. Maria's parents had flown out from Texas, and she could see the pride and amazement in their faces as they watched their daughter receive recognition for achieving something that most people would consider impossible. But Hell Week was just the beginning. The remaining phases of SEAL training would test different aspects of each candidate's abilities, from advanced combat tactics to specialized technical skills that would be essential in real-world operations. Maria knew that earning the Trident would require maintaining her performance standards for several more months of increasingly demanding training. The land warfare phase pushed candidates to master advanced marksmanship, combat tactics, and battlefield medicine. Maria excelled in the classroom components, demonstrating the analytical skills that had made her successful as an intelligence specialist. But she also proved herself capable of the split-second decision-making and aggressive mindset required for direct action missions. During a live-fire exercise designed to simulate urban combat conditions, Maria's team was tasked with clearing a building defended by instructors armed with training ammunition. The scenario required precise coordination, aggressive movement, and the ability to distinguish between hostile and friendly forces under extreme stress. Maria's performance as team leader earned praise from instructors who had spent their entire careers evaluating special operations candidates. The final phase of training focused on advanced diving operations and underwater demolitions. This was the skill set that had originally defined the SEAL mission, and it required a combination of technical expertise, physical conditioning, and mental toughness that pushed even the most capable candidates to their limits. Maria spent weeks learning to use advanced diving equipment, place explosive charges underwater, and navigate in conditions where visibility was measured in inches rather than feet. Her final exercise involved infiltrating a simulated enemy harbor, placing charges on multiple target vessels, and exfiltrating without being detected. The mission required swimming over 2 miles in open ocean, working underwater for extended periods, and maintaining operational security under conditions designed to simulate real-world combat operations.
Maria completed the mission flawlessly, demonstrating the technical proficiency and operational mindset that would make her an asset to any SEAL team.
When she surfaced after placing the final charge, she knew that she had earned her place among the most elite special operations forces in the world. The Trident ceremony was held on a Friday morning, with the Pacific Ocean providing a backdrop that reminded everyone present of the maritime heritage that defined the SEAL community.
As the commanding officer pinned the gold trident to Maria's uniform, she became the first woman in Navy history to earn the designation of Navy SEAL. The moment represented not just her personal achievement, but a fundamental shift in how the military defined combat capability and warrior ethos.
Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her night vision goggles and checked her watch for the third time in 10 minutes. 0200 hours in the mountains of Afghanistan, and her SEAL team was preparing for what intelligence reports suggested could be one of the most significant operations of their deployment.
After 6 months of proving herself on routine patrols and support missions, Maria was finally getting her chance to demonstrate her capabilities in a high-stakes direct-action mission. The target was a compound believed to house a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. Intelligence indicated that the commander was planning a major offensive that could result in significant American casualties if not disrupted. The mission parameters were straightforward: infiltrate the compound, capture or eliminate the high-value target, and gather any intelligence materials that might reveal additional terrorist operations. Maria's team leader, Chief Petty Officer Davidson, had initially been skeptical about having a woman assigned to his unit. Davidson was a 15-year SEAL veteran who had served multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he made no secret of his belief that combat operations were no place for women, regardless of their training or qualifications. But 6 months of working alongside Maria had gradually changed his perspective, and he now trusted her capabilities enough to assign her to the point position for tonight's operation. The approach to the target compound required a 2-mile movement through terrain that offered little concealment and multiple opportunities for enemy observation. Maria led the team through a series of irrigation ditches and abandoned buildings, using hand signals to communicate movement instructions and potential threats. Her smaller size allowed her to navigate tight spaces that would have been challenging for her larger teammates, and her intelligence background helped her identify defensive positions and escape routes that might not have been obvious to operators focused solely on the immediate tactical situation. As they approached the final approach phase, Maria spotted movement in a guard tower that had been reported as abandoned by reconnaissance teams. She immediately signaled for the team to take cover and spent several minutes observing the position through her scope. What she saw confirmed her suspicions. The compound was more heavily defended than intelligence reports had indicated, with at least 3 guards visible in positions that would allow them to call for reinforcements if the team was detected. Davidson made the decision to modify the mission plan, assigning Maria and another team member to neutralize the guard positions before the main assault team moved on the primary objective. This was exactly the kind of responsibility that Maria had been hoping for. An opportunity to demonstrate that she could handle the most demanding aspects of special operations missions. Maria and her partner, Petty Officer 2nd Class Johnson, separated from the main team and began a careful approach to the guard tower. The movement required them to cross nearly 200 meters of open ground while remaining completely undetected by guards who were actively scanning for threats.
Dash's automatic plotted seconds of audiences.
Maria used every piece of cover available, from abandoned farm equipment to small depressions in the ground, timing her movements to coincide with the guards' patrol patterns. The final approach to the tower required Maria to climb a 30-foot structure while carrying full combat equipment and maintaining complete noise discipline. One wrong move or moment of clumsiness would alert the guards and potentially compromise the entire mission.
This is the book, it's about history, Bing.
Maria had practiced similar climbs countless times during training, but never under actual combat conditions where mistakes could cost lives. She reached the top of the tower without incident and found herself face-to-face with a Taliban fighter who was more surprised than threatening. Maria's training took over, and she neutralized the guard using hand-to-hand combat techniques that left him unconscious but alive for potential intelligence exploitation. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds and was conducted in complete silence. Johnson had simultaneously neutralized the other guard position, and the team was able to proceed with the main assault as originally planned. Maria rejoined Davidson's element as they approached the primary building where the target was believed to be located. The building was larger than it had appeared in satellite imagery, with multiple rooms and potential hiding places that could complicate the search operation. The breach was executed flawlessly, with Maria serving as the number 2 person through the doorway behind Davidson. The interior of the building was dark and cluttered with furniture and equipment that created multiple potential threat positions. Maria's job was to cover Davidson's movement while scanning for targets and maintaining awareness of the team's position within the building. They found the target in a back room along with 2 other individuals who appeared to be planning some kind of operation. Based on the maps and communications equipment scattered around the space, the Taliban commander initially attempted to resist capture, reaching for a weapon that would have forced the team to respond with lethal force. But Maria's quick reaction and superior positioning allowed her to disarm him without compromising the intelligence value that his capture would provide. The intelligence materials recovered from the compound exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The team found detailed plans for coordinated attacks on 3 different coalition bases, communications logs that revealed the structure of the terrorist network throughout the region, and financial records that could be used to disrupt funding operations. Maria's intelligence background proved invaluable in quickly assessing the significance of the materials and prioritizing what needed to be collected for immediate analysis. The exfiltration from the target area went smoothly, but the real test came during the debriefing process back at the forward operating base. Maria knew that her performance on this mission would be analyzed and discussed by SEAL leadership at multiple levels, and that any mistakes or shortcomings would be magnified because of her status as the first woman in the teams. Davidson's assessment was unequivocal. Maria had performed exactly as he would have expected from any experienced SEAL operator. Her tactical awareness, technical proficiency, and ability to adapt to changing circumstances had contributed directly to the mission's success. More importantly, from a team perspective, her actions had demonstrated the kind of reliability and competence that builds trust among teammates who depend on each other for survival. The success of the mission and Maria's performance began to shift attitudes throughout the special operations community. Word spread through unofficial channels that the female SEAL had proven herself under actual combat conditions, earning respect from operators who had initially been skeptical about women in special operations roles. But the attention also brought additional scrutiny and pressure that Maria had to learn to manage.
Her next significant operation came 2 months later when intelligence reports indicated that a group of foreign fighters was using a remote village as a staging area for attacks against coalition supply convoys. The mission required a 5-day reconnaissance operation in mountainous terrain that would test the team's endurance and ability to remain undetected while gathering detailed intelligence about enemy activities.
Maria volunteered to serve as the primary observer for the mission, a role that required her to spend hours at a time in uncomfortable positions while monitoring enemy movements through high-powered optics. The physical demands were significant, but the mental challenges were even greater. A successful reconnaissance mission required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to distinguish between significant intelligence and routine activity that had no operational value. During the 3rd day of the operation, Maria observed what appeared to be a meeting between the local terrorist cell and a group of individuals who didn't match the typical profile of Taliban fighters.
Their equipment was more sophisticated, their discipline was better, and their tactical awareness suggested military training that went beyond what was typical for local insurgent groups. Her detailed observations and analysis helped identify the presence of foreign military advisors who were providing advanced training to local terrorist groups.
This intelligence proved crucial in understanding how insurgent capabilities had improved dramatically over the previous months, and it led to additional operations that significantly disrupted terrorist training activities throughout the region. The reconnaissance mission also demonstrated Maria's ability to function effectively as part of a small team operating independently for extended periods. The psychological stress of remaining hidden while surrounded by potential enemies tested every aspect of her mental preparation, but she maintained focus and professionalism throughout the operation. By the end of her first deployment, Maria had participated in over 30 combat operations, ranging from direct action missions to complex reconnaissance operations.
Her performance evaluations were consistently outstanding, and she had earned the respect of teammates who judged her solely on her ability to contribute to mission success. The skepticism that had greeted her arrival in the teams had been replaced by acceptance and professional recognition.
But her success also created new challenges. Maria found herself under constant scrutiny from media organizations eager to report on the first female Navy SEAL, and her every action was analyzed for its potential impact on the ongoing debate about women in combat roles.
She received speaking requests from military organizations, academic institutions, and women's groups, all wanting to hear about her experiences and perspectives. The attention was flattering, but also exhausting. Maria had joined the SEALs to serve her country and challenge herself in the most demanding military environment available, not to become a symbol or spokesperson for women's advancement in the military. She wanted to be judged on her performance as an operator, not celebrated or criticized because of her gender. Her team leadership understood these pressures and worked to shield Maria from distractions that could compromise her focus on mission preparation and execution. They made it clear that while her historic status was significant, her primary responsibility was to her teammates and the missions they were assigned to execute. The transition back to the United States after her first deployment was more difficult than Maria had anticipated. The intensity and clarity of purpose that defined combat operations were replaced by the routine demands of training cycles and administrative responsibilities. Maria found herself questioning whether she wanted to continue in special operations or pursue other opportunities within the Navy. The decision became more complicated when she received orders to Naval Special Warfare Command in Virginia Beach, where she would serve as an instructor for future SEAL candidates. The assignment represented both recognition of her expertise and an opportunity to influence the next generation of special operations personnel.
But it also meant stepping back from operational assignments and accepting a role that was more about her symbolic value than her tactical capabilities. During her first week at the training command, Maria met with the commanding officer to discuss her new responsibilities and the expectations that came with her unique position. Captain Morrison was a former SEAL team commander who understood both the operational demands of special operations and the political sensitivities surrounding Maria's assignment. Morrison was direct about the challenges she would face as an instructor.
Some candidates would resent being trained by a woman regardless of her qualifications and experience. Others would assume that her presence indicated a lowering of standards or a politically motivated change in SEAL culture. Maria would need to prove herself again to a new audience while maintaining the standards that had made SEAL training legendary for its difficulty and effectiveness.
The conversation also covered Maria's long-term career prospects within the special operations community.
While her performance had been exemplary, her options for advancement were limited by the reality that senior SEAL leadership positions had never been held by women.
Morrison encouraged her to think beyond traditional career paths and consider how her unique perspective and experience could contribute to the evolution of special operations doctrine and training methods. As Maria prepared for her new role as an instructor, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small Texas town to the elite world of naval special warfare. She had proven that women could meet the physical and mental demands of SEAL training and combat operations. But she had also learned that breaking barriers created new responsibilities and expectations that went far beyond individual achievement.
The mess hall at Naval Special Warfare Command buzzed with the familiar sounds of evening chow service. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez sat at a corner table with 3 other instructors, discussing the training schedule for the upcoming week, while mechanically working through a plate of what the cooks optimistically called beef stroganoff.
After 8 months at the command, Maria had settled into a routine that felt almost normal, despite the constant undercurrent of attention that came with being the only female SEAL in the facility. Sergeant First Class Derek Morrison watched Maria from across the room with the kind of focused attention that made other diners uncomfortable. Morrison was a 20-year Army veteran who had transferred to the Joint Special Operations Training Program 6 months earlier, bringing with him a reputation for aggressive leadership and an old-school mentality about military culture. At 42 years old, he was built like a linebacker and carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Morrison had made no secret of his disapproval of women in special operations roles. During instructor meetings, he consistently questioned training modifications that he claimed were designed to accommodate female candidates.
What backseat was the case determined that there was any protective...
In casual conversations, he expressed his belief that the integration of women into combat units was a political experiment that would ultimately cost lives and compromise mission effectiveness.
His comments were carefully calibrated to avoid direct violation of military equal opportunity policies, but his meaning was unmistakable to anyone who heard them.
Maria was aware of Morrison's attitude but had chosen to address it through professional excellence rather than confrontation. She consistently received outstanding performance evaluations. Her training classes produced candidates who met or exceeded all standards, and her relationships with other instructors were positive and productive. She believed that time and continued success would eventually change the minds of skeptics like Morrison, or at least marginalize their influence within the command.
The evening that would change everything started normally enough.
Maria finished her meal and was preparing to leave the mess hall
when Morrison approached her table with the deliberate swagger that characterized all his interactions. He had clearly been drinking, though not enough to be obviously intoxicated by military standards. The smell of alcohol on his breath was noticeable, but not overwhelming, and his speech was clear and controlled. Morrison's opening comment was loud enough to be heard by nearby diners, but carefully phrased to maintain plausible deniability about his intent.
He suggested that Maria might want to consider transferring to a training role that was more suited to her natural abilities, perhaps working with administrative personnel or support staff who could benefit from her organizational skills. The comment was delivered with a tone that suggested friendly advice, but everyone within earshot understood the underlying message.
Maria responded professionally, thanking Morrison for his concern, but indicating that she was satisfied with her current assignment and believed she was contributing effectively to the command's mission. She stood to leave, hoping to end the interaction before it escalated into something more problematic. But Morrison moved to block her path, using his larger size to create a physical barrier that forced her to remain engaged in the conversation. The tone of Morrison's comments became more aggressive as he continued talking.
He questioned whether Maria truly understood the life and death responsibilities that came with training future special operations personnel.
He suggested that her presence in the program was the result of political pressure rather than genuine qualifications, and he implied that her continued assignment was putting other instructors in difficult positions.
Other diners were beginning to pay attention to the interaction, and Maria could see that several of her fellow instructors were watching the situation with growing concern. She attempted to diffuse the tension by agreeing to discuss Morrison's concerns in a more appropriate setting, perhaps during a scheduled meeting with their supervisor, but Morrison interpreted her diplomatic response as weakness and pressed his advantage. Morrison stepped closer to Maria, using his physical presence in a way that crossed the line from aggressive conversation to intimidation. He placed his hand on her shoulder in what could have been construed as a friendly gesture, but his grip was firm enough to prevent her from stepping away. His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear, and his words left no doubt about his true intentions. He told Maria that he had been watching her for months, evaluating her performance in her interactions with male personnel. He suggested that her success was the result of special treatment and lowered standards rather than genuine competence. He implied that she owed her position to the political climate rather than her qualifications, and he offered to help her understand what real special operations standards looked like. Morrison's hand moved from Maria's shoulder to her upper arm, and his grip tightened in a way that was unmistakably aggressive rather than friendly.
He leaned closer, invading her personal space in a manner that would have been inappropriate under any circumstances, but was particularly threatening given the power dynamics at play.
His breath was hot against her ear as he continued his whispered commentary. The specific words Morrison used were crude and explicitly sexual, detailing what he believed Maria would need to do to earn genuine respect from male special operations personnel. His comments revealed a mindset that viewed women primarily as sexual objects rather than professional colleagues, and his tone suggested that he saw himself as entitled to treat her according to his personal preferences rather than military protocols.
Maria's training kicked in as Morrison's behavior escalated from harassment to physical assault.
She had spent years learning to recognize threatening situations and respond with appropriate force, and her instincts told her that Morrison's actions were moving towards something much more serious than inappropriate comments. When he attempted to pull her closer while continuing his whispered threats, she knew that de-escalation was no longer an option. The defensive techniques that Maria employed were exactly what she had been trained to use against opponents who used size and position to create tactical advantages. Morrison's larger size and apparent assumption that she would be too intimidated to resist had caused him to make several strategic errors that left him vulnerable to someone with her training and experience. Maria's first move was designed to break Morrison's grip on her arm without creating obvious signs of a struggle that might be misinterpreted by observers. She used a pressure point technique that caused him to release her involuntarily while appearing to onlookers as though she had simply stepped away from his touch. But Morrison's response confirmed that his intentions were more serious than inappropriate conversation.
Morrison immediately reached for Maria again, this time with both hands and with obvious intent to physically control her movement. His face showed a combination of anger and arousal that left no doubt about what he was planning to do if he managed to isolate her from the other diners.
Maria's defensive response was swift, precise, and devastating in its effectiveness. The technique that Maria used was one she had practiced thousands of times during hand-to-hand combat training. Morrison's forward momentum and aggressive positioning created the perfect opportunity for a defensive counter that would neutralize his advantage while minimizing the risk of escalation. Her strike was delivered with surgical precision to a target that would immediately disable him without causing permanent injury. The sound of Morrison's jaw breaking was audible throughout the mess hall, a sharp crack that cut through the ambient noise of conversations and clinking dinnerware. Morrison dropped to the floor immediately, clutching his face and struggling to process what had just happened. The entire interaction had lasted less than 10 seconds, but the consequences would reverberate through the military establishment for months to come. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and confusing. Other diners rushed to Morrison's aid while trying to understand what they had witnessed. Some had seen enough of the interaction to understand that Morrison had been aggressive and inappropriate, but others had only noticed the final moments when Maria's defensive action had resulted in obvious injury to a senior non-commissioned officer.
Maria remained standing exactly where the incident had occurred, making no attempt to flee or minimize what had happened. She immediately identified herself to the senior instructor present and requested that military police be notified to investigate the incident.
Her calm response and professional demeanor contrasted sharply with Morrison's obvious distress and helped establish the narrative that would guide the subsequent investigation.
The military police response was swift and thorough. Within minutes, the mess hall was secured as a crime scene, and everyone present was identified as a potential witness. Maria was separated from Morrison and other personnel while investigators began the process of documenting physical evidence and collecting witness statements that would determine how the incident would be officially characterized.
Morrison was transported to the base medical facility for treatment of his injuries, which included a broken jaw, several loosened teeth, and soft tissue damage that would require weeks to heal properly.
The medical documentation of his injuries would become a crucial element in the investigation, both as evidence of the force Maria had used and as proof of the defensive nature of her actions.
Maria was also examined by medical personnel who documented defensive injuries on her arms and shoulder that corroborated her account of Morrison's aggressive behavior.
The medical evidence supported her claim that she had been physically restrained and threatened before using force to defend herself, and it provided objective documentation that would be crucial in any subsequent legal proceedings.
The initial witness statements painted a complex picture of the incident and a bit of a sad expression on whether molecular products were tied in the long, but it wasn't clear enough to pass.
Several diners confirmed that Morrison had approached Maria's table uninvited and had engaged in conversation that appeared to become increasingly aggressive. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Morrison place his hands on Maria in ways that appeared inappropriate and threatening.
But the specific details of their interaction were harder to establish, since most observers had not been close enough to hear the actual words exchanged. The investigation that followed would ultimately involve multiple levels of military and civilian law enforcement, congressional oversight committees, and media attention that transformed a single incident in a mess hall into a national conversation about military culture, sexual harassment, and the integration of women into combat roles.
But on that Tuesday evening, as investigators worked to document what had happened, Maria found herself facing the possibility that her military career might be over before she turned 30.
The conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command had never felt smaller to Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez as she waited for the Article 32 hearing to begin.
6 weeks had passed since the incident with Sergeant First Class Morrison, and those weeks had transformed her from a respected instructor into the central figure in a controversy that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. Media trucks lined the streets outside the base. Congressional representatives had demanded briefings, and Maria had become a symbol in a debate she had never wanted to join.
The military justice system had moved with unusual speed to convene the preliminary hearing that would determine whether Maria would face court-martial for assault charges. Morrison's broken jaw and the presence of 281 witnesses had made the incident impossible to ignore or handle through administrative channels.
But the investigation had also uncovered evidence that complicated the simple narrative of a female service member attacking a male superior. Captain Sarah Chen, Maria's appointed defense counsel, was a former Navy JAG officer who had specialized in military sexual assault cases for over a decade.
Chen had initially been skeptical about taking on a case that appeared to involve clear-cut assault charges, but her investigation had revealed a pattern of harassment and intimidation that transformed her understanding of what had happened in the mess hall that night. The evidence Chen had compiled painted a disturbing picture of Morrison's behavior during his 6 months at the command. Multiple female personnel had reported inappropriate comments and unwelcome advances, but most had been reluctant to file formal complaints against a senior non-commissioned officer with an otherwise exemplary service record. The military's informal culture had discouraged reporting, and Morrison's careful attention to avoiding obvious violations of written policies had made him difficult to discipline through normal channels. Chen's investigation had also uncovered digital evidence that proved Morrison's harassment of Maria had been systematic rather than spontaneous.
Text messages recovered from his personal phone revealed that he had been planning to confront Maria for weeks, and his communications with friends outside the military included explicit threats about what he intended to do to put her in her place.
The electronic evidence provided crucial context that transformed the mess hall incident from an inexplicable explosion of violence into the culmination of a sustained campaign of intimidation. The prosecution team, led by Major Robert Sterling, faced the challenging task of pursuing assault charges against a defendant who appeared to have been defending herself from sexual assault. Sterling was a by-the-book military prosecutor who believed that maintaining good order and discipline required consistent enforcement of regulations regardless of extenuating circumstances. But he was also experienced enough to understand that the evidence would make conviction difficult, and that public scrutiny would intensify if the case proceeded to court-martial. The Article 32 hearing was scheduled to last 3 days, with testimony from dozens of witnesses who had been present in the mess hall during the incident. The proceedings were closed to the public, but leaked details appeared in news reports almost daily, creating a parallel trial in the court of public opinion that complicated the legal process. Military officials struggled to balance transparency with operational security, while managing a story that had captured national attention. The first day of testimony focused on the physical evidence and immediate aftermath of the incident. Military police investigators presented a detailed timeline of events, supported by security camera footage that captured portions of the interaction between Maria and Morrison.
The video evidence was grainy and lacked audio, but it clearly showed Morrison approaching Maria's table, engaging in an increasingly animated conversation and making physical contact that appeared to escalate into a struggle.
Medical testimony provided crucial details about the injuries sustained by both parties. Morrison's broken jaw required surgical repair and would leave him with permanent limitations in his ability to speak clearly. But the defensive injuries documented on Maria's arms and shoulders supported her account of being physically restrained and threatened before she responded with force.
The medical evidence suggested that Morrison had been the aggressor and that Maria's response had been proportionate to the threat she faced. The second day brought testimony from witnesses who had observed the interaction between Maria and Morrison.
Their accounts varied in detail and perspective, but a consistent pattern emerged of Morrison approaching Maria uninvited, engaging in conversation that appeared to become hostile, and making physical contact that seemed to distress her. Several witnesses reported hearing Morrison make inappropriate comments, though the specific words were difficult to verify due to the ambient noise in the mess hall.
The most compelling testimony came from Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, who had been seated at a nearby table and had observed the entire interaction. Walsh testified that Morrison's behavior had appeared threatening from the beginning, and that his physical contact with Maria had been obviously unwelcome and aggressive.
Her account provided crucial details about Morrison's demeanor and Maria's attempts to defuse the situation before resorting to physical defense. Walsh also testified about Morrison's general attitude toward female personnel, describing comments and behaviors that she had witnessed over the previous months.
Her testimony established a pattern of harassment that supported Maria's claim that the mess hall incident was part of a longer campaign of intimidation rather than an isolated misunderstanding that had escalated unexpectedly.
The third day of testimony featured the principals themselves, with Morrison and Maria providing their competing accounts of what had happened and why.
Morrison's testimony was hampered by his ongoing medical issues, but he maintained that his interaction with Maria had been appropriate professional counseling that she had misinterpreted as harassment.
He claimed that her violent response was evidence of emotional instability that made her unsuitable for special operations assignments. Morrison's credibility was severely damaged when Chen cross-examined him about the text messages recovered from his phone.
Under oath, he was forced to acknowledge that he had discussed Maria in crude sexual terms with friends, and that he had expressed anger about women being assigned to special operations roles. His attempts to characterize these communications as harmless venting were undermined by their explicit content and the timing of their transmission.
Maria's testimony was calm, detailed, and consistent with the physical evidence and witness accounts. She described Morrison's pattern of harassment over the previous months, his escalating behavior on the night in question, and her assessment that he intended to assault her sexually if she did not defend herself. Her account of the defensive technique she had used was clinically precise, demonstrating both her professional competence and her understanding of appropriate force levels. Chen's presentation of Maria's testimony emphasized her exemplary service record, her commitment to military values, and her reluctant decision to use force only when all other options had been exhausted.
Maria's calm demeanor and professional responses contrasted sharply with Morrison's emotional and defensive testimony, creating a credible narrative that supported her claim of self-defense.
The hearing officer, Colonel Michael Thompson, was a combat veteran with over 25 years of military experience who understood both the importance of maintaining discipline and the reality of sexual harassment in military settings. His questioning of both parties was thorough and fair, focusing on establishing the facts rather than advancing either side's preferred narrative. Thompson's recommendations were delivered 2 weeks after the hearing concluded, and they represented a vindication of Maria's actions that exceeded even Chen's most optimistic expectations. Thompson concluded that Morrison had engaged in a pattern of sexual harassment that culminated in attempted sexual assault, and that Maria's defensive response had been reasonable and proportionate to the threat she faced. The recommendation that Morrison be court-martialed for sexual harassment and attempted sexual assault was accompanied by criticism of the command climate that had allowed his behavior to continue for months without effective intervention. Thompson's report called for systemic changes in how complaints were investigated and how female personnel were protected from retaliation for reporting harassment. The Secretary of the Navy's decision to accept Thompson's recommendations and dismiss all charges against Maria was announced at a press conference that generated national news coverage. Maria was not only cleared of wrongdoing, but was commended for her professionalism in handling a dangerous situation with appropriate restraint.
The announcement was seen as a watershed moment in the military's handling of sexual harassment cases. Morrison's court-martial 3 months later resulted in conviction on multiple charges and a sentence that included dismissal from service, forfeiture of benefits, and a term of confinement in a military prison.
The proceedings received extensive media coverage and sent a clear message about the military's commitment to enforcing standards of conduct that protected all service members from harassment and assault. The broader impact of Maria's case extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. Her willingness to defend herself physically and then stand up to the military justice system inspired changes in training programs, reporting procedures, and command oversight that improved conditions for women throughout the military. Her case became a touchstone for discussions about military culture and the integration of women into combat roles. Maria's subsequent assignments took her back to operational units, where she continued to serve with distinction in increasingly responsible positions. Her experience during the harassment case had taught her about the political dimensions of military service, but it had also reinforced her commitment to the values and standards that had drawn her to the Navy in the first place. Years later, as she looked back on the incident that had defined her early career, Maria recognized that her decision to fight back had been about more than self-defense. It had been about refusing to accept that her gender made her acceptable target for harassment and assault. By standing her ground, both physically and legally, she had helped establish that women in the military deserved the same protection and respect accorded to any service member. The legacy of Maria's case continued to influence military policy and culture long after she retired from active duty. Training programs incorporated lessons learned from her experience. Reporting procedures were strengthened to protect victims of harassment, and command structures were modified to ensure that complaints received appropriate attention and investigation.
Maria's story became required reading at military academies and professional development schools, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of integrating women into combat units, but as an example of how individual courage and institutional accountability could work together to uphold the highest standards of military service. Her example inspired a new generation of women to pursue careers in special operations, confident that their contributions would be valued and their safety protected.
The incident that began with harassment and ended with a broken jaw had transformed into something much larger than a single case of self-defense. It had become a catalyst for change that improved the military for everyone who served, and a testament to the power of standing up for what is right even when the personal cost might be enormous.
In defending herself that night in the mess hall, Maria had not only protected her own safety and dignity, but had struck a blow for justice that resonated throughout the entire military establishment.